Hey everyone, my name is Nathan Jones, and if you're new here, welcome. I like to talk about all things movies, specifically Blu-rays, and today is a super episode of my film journey. Lately, I've been going through this journey of mine where I physically journal everything that I am watching and everything that I'm picking up, and it has been a total blast. And now we're at week 7 and 8. And if you've been following along, you probably ask yourself, haven't you been putting this out each week? So how are we at episode 8? This is a super episode, right? Well, the reason being is I've always been a week behind. And so today I'm going to be covering August 25th all the way up till September 7th, which was just yesterday. So I am excited to jump into a lot of the excellent shows and movies that I watched. With that being said, before we jump into this madness, I would love to know in the comment section down below what you've been watching for these last few weeks. Has there been anything in particular that has piqued your interest? I would love to know down there. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. But let's jump into the craziness that is these last 2 weeks. And one big fish to fry is something very familiar, something we have to finish, I think. I wonder what that could be. Okay, so I have my cup of coffee. I have Twin Peaks. So, if you're not familiar, I have been going through this journey for the first time. This is the first time I've ever watched Twin Peaks. I know I'm a little bit behind, but I just got to season 3, episode 8 of The Return, which is its own thing. It's a masterpiece. If you're familiar or curious to hear my thoughts on it, on my last journey, I talked about that and how much that it really impacted me. And I'm going to talk about that today as well. But spoilers ahead for people who don't watch Twin Peaks or haven't seen it, definitely skip to this part of the video where I talk about movies. And I'm not talking about Twin Peaks itself. But I really want to talk about how these last few episodes really impacted me and also just the general themes of this show. Because I started thinking about this as I was coming up with this part of the video where I was starting to think, should I go episode by episode? And honestly, I don't really think I want to, because The Return really is this 18-part, one long vision from David Lynch himself. He really wanted to make this into a movie. And cutting it out at episode 8, where that was that starting point personally for me to feel where I started to finally understand a little bit more of myself as I'm watching Lynch. Of course, as people have probably jumped into this show before, or even, watching any David Lynch film, trying to explain what he's doing is a moot point. You can't do it, right? You can have your own interpretation of it, and that's the most important thing, but how you engage with that is what I find fascinating. And for me, I noticed myself more and more, especially in episode 8, as I transitioned into this next section of the series, as I was finishing it up. I started noticing things smaller and smaller and the more mundane, and those little moments that can literally be nothing, or it could be everything. And that is the specialty of what Lynch is done to me, at least in my day-to-day life. I've been watching myself go through my routines of things like making a cup of coffee, right? Or, maybe going to work. I've been noticing how beautiful, I guess, things are, but also at the same time, really things that are just everyday and routine, they don't have to mean anything either. And that's what makes it so wonderful. But that's my own interpretation. I'm sure I'm going into a tangent. But let's go back to here. So going back to the episodic breakdown, I really don't want to do that, because things kind of culminate to where post episode 8, you get to the story where you see it resolved in episode 17, where you see all of the cast and crew, the characters who are involved in this story, kind of coming together in the sheriff's office and really having that finality that is this show. But is it really finished? And that's where episode 18 comes into play. But I do want to mention a little bit about 17 and what makes it so brilliant and lovable, and just to kind of see all of the characters come together, and also just to see David Lynch kind of giving a love letter to all of the people that he's worked with in the past. That's kind of what I reflected back on as I was watching this, and seeing that, and can't even imagining waiting 25 years to actually watch this show from season 2 to season 3, The Return, and seeing all of those movies that happened beforehand, which are also referenced, I think, quite a bit in The Return. There are some really special moments when it comes to Lynch and how he cares about the people he's collaborated with and his vision. And you can see that on full display in episode 17, where he's having the time of his life. It's horrifying. It's comedic. There's a guy with a glove who is punching Bob's orb, the spirit that comes out of Cooper's doppelganger, which, like, again, I'm not getting super into details, but it's just really fun to see the playfulness and the care that he puts within, Twin Peaks itself, and then also the world that he loves to create, this surreal escapism that I quite enjoy. The biggest love letter is to Cooper right here, and to Kyle MacLachlan, and then also Laura Dern. So episode 18 gets into this very interesting space where you're expecting to get answers for a lot of things, and I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Obviously, if you've been watching this entire show or know anything about David Lynch, you know that you're not going to get any answers. You're just going to sit there and think about it over and over and over again. And the last few weeks, I've really been thinking about this just a lot. I don't think I mentioned this, but all through week 7, I pretty much watched Twin Peaks. So in week 8, I get more to movies. I did watch some movies in between the time, and we'll get to that. You see them in this world of Twin Peaks trying to find an answer, going back to Laura Palmer's house. That drive that takes half the episode really sat with me. It's one that I honestly was a little frustrated with at first, and saw myself really getting a little bit more anxious. But I also realized, you know what, this has been one of the most beautiful journeys I've ever went through. And I started thinking about the past few months of me watching this show, and how much I'm going to miss this entire experience, because it has been an absolute blast waking up in the morning, making my cup of coffee, and wishing I had a cherry pie with me. I've been doing it wrong, right? And watching this show and seeing this tunnel vision of what this crazy story is, and getting to that point, getting to the end, was horrifying but also relieving. So besides that love letter to Laura Dern, we also have a love letter to Cheryl Lee, and we also have a love letter to Laura Palmer. Laura Palmer and Cooper, not Laura Palmer, go back to Laura Palmer's original house where a lot of these events transpired. And the owners, who are the actual real life owners of the house in real life, answer the door and really reflect back at no, we don't know who Laura Palmer is. She's never owned this house. And it ends with them walking away. You hear Laura Palmer's mom screaming Laura's name as she disappears. Kyle MacLachlan looks at the house. Things just go to black. Oh my God. There's also lights that flash into the house, and I mean, it's a crazy visual, but at the same time, that's how the series ends, and it ends on a tragedy of that cyclical, to me, that cyclical nature of that being trapped within this world. But also at the same time, going back to episode 17, thinking of that dynamic right here of loving the people that he's worked with, but also embracing the weird and the surreal. It's been a total blast, and it's been horrifying. It's been fun. It's something to make me ponder, and I'm going to be thinking about this for days. In fact, so much so that now we can jump into the movies, but I've been wanting to watch more Lynch now that I've watched this, and so I actually have right here some of his films that, besides Fire Walk with Me, I want to revisit some of his work. So I want to revisit these works right here. I have Mulholland Drive, Blue Velvet, Elephant Man, which I've never seen before, and Eraserhead. I also have ordered some other Lynch films just to jump back into this world, but I am ecstatic to jump into this stuff. I know I'm that typical male who finally discovered Lynch. I'm sure my rambling will probably irritate some, but I really love Twin Peaks, and I'm really excited to dive into the extra features, which I have been doing, and it's been real fun to see how frustrating and how loving David Lynch is and Mark Frost with these characters. So anyway, let's jump into the movies that I've been watching for week 7 and week 8. I've watched some stuff on streaming, and I've also watched a lot of things on physical disc. In fact, we'll get to week 8, but I may or may not have watched a lot of things in terms of the things that I just recently picked up. So let's go back to August 25th, where I was still dog sitting. So I was in a different house, and I woke up really early because I'm not sleeping in my own bed. So I didn't really sleep very much. So instead, I started put on a streaming service. I believe it was Prime is what I watched this on, but it is Daniel Isn't Real from 2019. and this is directed by Adam Egypt Mortimer, and I had to do a split take and think, wait, Adam Agoyan? And I'm like, okay, different person completely. But this is a story about a boy who has an imaginary friend who could be more than an imaginary friend. We put him away somehow at the very beginning because something dark happens, but 20 years later, it's coming back to haunt him and his mother and his whole family. I really, really enjoyed it, and something that I'm very curious to dive a little bit further into, and I don't want to get too much away because it's definitely something that is a lot of fun, and I think it is fun to kind of play with the idea of that imaginary friend being another entity entirely, and seeing that kind of come across. And yeah, it was a fun time. But I would give this movie a 3.5 out of 5. It kind of reminded me of some Stephen King novels, and that kind of story, it definitely had that energy to it. Now let's jump to Tuesday night, where I was taking a little bit of a break from Twin Peaks, and I decided to watch the 2021 version of Wrong Turn. Now, I know a lot of people are a fan of this series and know this is complete, like, this is the American version of this story. It's a completely different retelling of it. But I had a good time. It definitely reminded me more of something like The Wicker Man, and how it kind of transpired. It jumped genres quite a bit. It definitely started off as a survival horror story in the Appalachian Mountains with these group of friends getting captured by an unknown group of things, and it develops into something completely different in the vein of something like The Wicker Man or The Village. That's kind of the energy that I got from it, and I thought it was really unique in that aspect. But going back to the original Wrong Turns, I haven't watched any of those films. I've watched the first one years ago when it first came out, but I don't remember it at all much. But I quite enjoyed this retelling of something that also has a new, unique kind of perspective to it. I enjoyed it nonetheless. I would still give it like a 2.5 out of 5. It was a good time. I definitely need to revisit the first Wrong Turn and kind of watch those films in general. I'm definitely curious about it, but it was a fun time on Netflix, and yeah, definitely check out Wrong Turn if you're curious about it. Then we're moving on to Thursday, where I am still taking a break from Twin Peaks. As I'm finishing this off, I decided to watch, finally, for the first time, 2014's Creep. So Creep is directed by Patrick Brice and is starring Mark Duplass, who is excellent in the titular role. He literally plays that guy to a T. It is a found footage story of an individual who put up a Craigslist ad, being Mark Duplass, of this guy who took it up and is filming his experiencing staying with this character and just kind of observing him. That's what he wanted to do. He just wanted to make a new friend, right? And that's where things start getting a little strange. There's a wolf mask. There's some really obsessive stuff going on with Mark Duplass. You can tell like something's not right. And it ends in a very crazy way. And I'm not going to get into it, but we are going to talk about Creep 2, but not until week 8, which we will talk about later in this episode of the film journey. But I really enjoyed Creep, and I thought it was a really refreshing look at the found footage story. And it's crazy to me that it took me this long to finally watch it, 10 years after it came out, and also the second one. But it was a fun time nonetheless, and I definitely recommend people check this movie out. It is unsettling, to say the least. I would give it a 4 out of 5. Definitely worth checking out. Go watch a Creep. So as I was going to the weekend, I was thinking about this movie. It's been constantly popping up in my head, and I'm talking about Patterson. I recently did a video where I have decided to start this idea of a peculiar pairing, because I just recently picked up Perfect Days, and I thought this would be a really fantastic double pairing. And so that's kind of where I wanted to shift. You know, I was finishing Twin Peaks, but right before it, I wanted to take a little bit of a breather and watch something where I was starting to notice that kind of element of what I was talking about in Twin Peaks, where I was starting to understand the routine, the mundane, that stuff that was really making me tick. Maybe that's probably what was populating in my head as I was thinking about Patterson. Now, I've seen this film before. It's directed by Jim Jarmusch and starring Adam Driver, who is absolutely terrific. I cannot even say his wife's name correctly, but Farahani is her last name, and she is terrific as well as his eccentric wife, who has all these really beautiful ideas that never come to fruition. But he is a man who is just going through his week, his routine, his schedule. He's a city bus driver. He also writes poetry, and it's gorgeous. It's just beautiful to see him reflect as he's going through his days. But also some things happen this week where they're kind of out of the ordinary and kind of bucks him from that routine. And it just makes him frustrated, but at the same time realize what he has, right? And it's really precious. This movie is terrific, and I definitely wanted to jump into this again because it's been in my mind nonstop. But I'd give this a 5 out of 5. This movie has honestly stuck with me so much longer than I expected it to. But that makes me think a little bit more about jumping into its other pairing, Perfect Days. So before I jump into this, I do want to say I am going to jump deeper into the pairings of the month. What I'm doing is I'm going to be pairing, peculiar pairings each week. I'm going to be putting that on Instagram and also on the community tab, and I'm going to be talking about different pairings. But at the end of the month, we're going to be doing a live stream, and we're going to be, I'm actually, if you want to, save this date right here. This is going to be the live stream time and date. And we're going to talk about these pairings a little bit more in depth. And I also just am curious to hear some other pairings that you have as we do this live stream. But going back to Perfect Days, along with Patterson. So I just got this film. I picked it up when I went to Arkansas at Barnes & Noble and got the 50% off. This film is directed by Wim Wenders, and it came out in 2023. So just last year. This is the 4K edition, and it looks gorgeous, and it feels just as beautiful as Patterson in a very different way. We're following this character who I can't remember his name, but he is played wonderfully by Koji Yakasho, and he is a janitor who has these really, really sweet tics about him, where he is just kind of enjoying the mundaneness of what he's doing as he's cleaning and waking up and putting away his bed, and also changing out the music that he listens to every day. It makes you crack a smile on it. And there's some other weird things that happen in this story that are very reminiscent of Patterson in the terms of things that are kind of bucking our main character out of his routine, but it really is precious enough to where you start noticing the smaller things that make life so beautiful. And yeah, this was just a really perfect pairing. And honestly, I'm just really excited to jump back into this because I don't think I fully understood everything about this movie upon the first watch. And I definitely want to revisit this. It is yearning for me to watch it again, just like Patterson was for me. But this is a great pairing right there. And speaking of pairings, I actually watched 2 other pairings, and this is actually kind of the shift to week 8, where I started watching some of the things that I picked up during my recent travels. I recently went to Kansas City, and I went up to see my friends KB and Disconnected, Ryan, and we went to Barnes & Noble, and we also went to Vintage Stock, and so I got quite a bit of titles, and one of the titles I got was Mute Witness. And upon watching this over the weekend, I was having an absolute blast, reminding myself of the 90s thrillers mixed in with like a De Palma. But I started thinking about another pairing, Wait Until Dark, which is a film that I've seen before and I really love. So getting back to the peculiar pairings, I'm gonna do a really quick highlight before we jump into Mute Witness and Wait Until Dark. So if anyone is curious, so this next week we're going to be jumping in to something really special that I'm very excited about, because a little something has been announced recently. It's the All the Haunts BR's box set volume 2 from Severin that I am a huge fan of. I'm a huge fan of folk horror and have been a huge fan of this genre for over the last few years, in particular, ever since The Witch really came out in 2015. But, to enable that love of that box set, of the first box set, and then also folk horror, I want to jump into some more folk horror films, and so I decided to choose In the Earth and also Wakewood. So these are 2 Blu-rays that I've had on my shelf that I've had for maybe a little bit of time, and I definitely want to watch these movies. But this is going to be my new pairing for the week. This is going to be week 3 for the peculiar pairings, but I am very curious about this, and so we'll talk more about these films in the live stream when we get to them. Let's go back to the second pairing, which is Mute Witness and Wait Until Dark. So Mute Witness right here. This is starring Marina Sedina, who is Billy Hughes, who is this mute woman who witnesses this horrific crime. It almost looks like a snuff film. That's kind of what it feels like. It is involved with the KGB because it's actually filmed a lot in Russia. But she witnesses this crime, but she is also mute herself, so she can't really say what is happening, even though everybody who I guess she interacts with either doesn't believe her or is trying to kill her because of that. And it's just, I love the labyrinth that this film kind of portrays, and it goes back to the thing I was just saying earlier about De Palma. It's got that voyeuristic kind of identity to it, but also it has twists and turns of something like The Game, where you would see Fincher's kind of work. This was a terrific film. It's directed by Anthony Waller, who had created The Piper and An American Werewolf in London. He directed that. Didn't write that, of course, Landis did. But this was a terrific 4K. It looked great. Arrow did a really fantastic job of this. There's some really great special features on here as well. The Wizard Behind the Curtain, a brand new visual essay by author and critic Chris Alexander, that was one of my favorite parts of this particular journey, but definitely worth checking out. Pick up this disc. It is worth your time. I would give this a 4 out of 5. It's definitely something that I'm going to be watching more and more of as I jump and progress throughout, my journey. And the other film that I got and started thinking about was Wait Until Dark, because obviously with Mute Witness, we have somebody who can't speak. Well, I started thinking about this movie, which I had seen before, Wait Until Dark. It's Audrey Hepburn, who is a blind woman, and we also have Alan Arkin in this, and Richard Crenna. This came out in 1967, I believe, and is a terrific thriller that is like a daylight thriller that you can really see literally everything. This film is set up kind of like a theatrical production where it's all in one location. It definitely feels like a screenplay of sorts, and a good masterclass of it too. And it has very Hitchcockian elements to it, but also that thriller aspect that you would see later on in like Polanski's work or De Palma's work and stuff like that. But this has its own unique charm to it too. And Audrey Hepburn is terrific in her nonverbals, but also in the fact that she can explore the apartment and see what's going on. There's this crazy story where she gets kind of involved in this crime of these hidden drugs, but it's a lot more sinister than what it looks like. Alan Arkin in particular being that sinister presence, along with some other corrupt police chiefs, and there's some manipulation going on, and there's a really great jump scare, one of the best jump scares ever in this movie, just of all time. I definitely recommend people check this movie out. I would give that movie a 4.5 out of 5. It is a terrific one, and one that is just so much fun to revisit, even if I know the outcome of the film. So as we're jumping off of the peculiar pairings, I also watched another streaming film that kind of goes back to the Wrong Turn film, where I watched the movie Significant Other from 2022. This is directed by Robert Olson and Dan Burke, and is about a couple who goes out into the woods trying to get their relationship back in order, but one half of the couple is not what he seems to be. I may have gave it a little bit away, and is a little overbearing, and but this is a typical kind of thriller, I guess, of sorts. It has that atmosphere that I think is probably the best part of this film. But I don't think I mentioned Micah, who is in this film, who is terrific. She's probably the best part of this movie besides the atmosphere. She just recently was in Longlegs, of course, but I enjoyed this movie, but it's definitely something that I probably wouldn't revisit. It definitely feels like it gives itself away really early in the film, so the tension for me is not as much there, and maybe this film wasn't made for me, and that's okay. But I did enjoy it nonetheless, and definitely recommend people check it out for themselves. But I'd give it like a 2.5 out of 5. So let's jump back into the physical discs, and The World of Bound is coming up next. And because I just recently watched Mute Witness, I wanted to go back to the 90s and watch some thriller, kind of erotic thriller, neo-noir kind of aspects. I've been in that world, obviously, being in Twin Peaks and watching that kind of stuff. I recently picked up Bound from the Wachowskis. This is their directorial debut film, and you could tell that they would go on to stuff like The Matrix, because you can definitely tell visually by the different types of styling that would happen on in this movie. It definitely transitioned to that silver screen, and I really enjoyed it. But this is starring Gina Gershon, who plays Corky, who kind of falls for this woman, Violet, who's played by Jennifer Tilly, and this is a sultry film, to say the least, but it is also a very honest, look, and I feel like it is a film that really does look at a lesbian relationship, and in a very loving way, I suppose, and less on the voyeuristic way. But obviously, I'm a male, so what can I say about this particular film in general? But I feel like it was handled with a lot of care, and the Wachowskis did that really, really well. But those two get together. There's a lot of upended criminal stuff going on in between this relationship, and what makes it so, I guess, heart pounding and thrilling is, will they be caught together in this relationship that they definitely shouldn't be in, or should they? We also have Joe Pantoliano, who is really fantastic in it as well. Very scary as his character portrays, but yeah, this is just a really great neo-noir erotic thriller that I didn't expect to love as much as I did. And yeah, I'd give this like a 4 out of 5. It's definitely worth checking out and picking up. And yeah, pick it out from Criterion. Also during the weekend, I was thinking a lot about these films, actually there's 2 of them, that were sitting on my shelf that I'm like, you know what, these are literally the last 2 of this line that I have on my shelf, and that is The Souvenir and Souvenir Part 2. And I've been wanting to watch this for some time now, but I've not really had the stomach or the idea to jump into it. And I don't know why, but I finally did. And this is directed by Joanna Hogg. So The Souvenir follows this young woman who is in film school in the 1980s in London, and falls for this guy who is older than her and also very manipulative. And that's kind of where the first story kind of transpires, where they are in this very tumultuous relationship, and it's very toxic, and you can definitely tell, especially when you get to part 2, the aftermath of that relationship, which I feel like I didn't really expect after I was watching the first film. Didn't expect it to go in the direction that it was. Like, why is there a part 2 necessarily? But it dawned on me as somebody who's went through an aftermath of something like this very toxic relationship. I realized what this cathartic thing was for Joanna Hogg herself, which I didn't think I mentioned, as well as this actually is kind of semi-autobiographical for her, because she was this person who went through something very similar to this. And so I feel like this is her reflecting back on this time in her life, in her early life in film school, and going through that period, and then getting out of it, and trying to piece together what it meant to her. Going back to these films themselves, it's a terrific double feature, and I actually love the second one a lot more, because I feel like there is a lot of breadth happening to catch up with something where somebody went through something so tragic, or something that they expected it to be a lot more than what they bargained for. I would give these films 4 or 4.5 out of 5. These movies are terrific. I'll definitely have to revisit this. It's gorgeous. It's also shot very, very vividly, and almost very, I guess, honestly. It's hard to describe, because it almost has it feels like it has a tint to it for the time period that it was set for, the 80s, but also it definitely has its own stylistic choice in terms of where the camera is set in place. And I love the different placements that the camera is taking at this, at angles that you wouldn't normally see in a period piece kind of retelling of a romance, right? It's really good. It's a terrific film, and yeah, The Souvenir and Souvenir Part 2, definitely worth checking out if you've not seen these films before. And I love this box set. I actually was also able to watch Caprice, which is a short film from 1986, which I think pairs really well with this as well, because I mentioned earlier that this is autobiographical, right? So a lot of that kind of, I feel like, pours over into Joanna Hogg's work about this student who's trying to get into a fashion magazine. But it's a very surreal look at that during that time period, and it was a fun time too. But yeah, The Souvenir, definitely worth checking out. A great set of films. A very heavy set of films, but definitely worth checking out. So now let's pivot to some of those titles that I picked up over the weekend, and I just dived into, and I had so much fun with these next 2 ones, these Norwegian films, Dead Snow and Dead Snow 2, Red vs. Dead. So let's first jump into Dead Snow, where this group of teenagers full of rambunctious sex and rock and roll go up to the mountains and in Norway, and accidentally waken these Nazi zombies. And these I guess these Nazis were in this particular spot where I guess they were stationed during World War II in Norway as they were occupied. But these dumb kids have their, as they're facing these hordes of undead soldiers, but also at the same time the hilarious things that they do to try to get out of the situation. It definitely feels like Evil Dead in a very Sam Raimi type of way, but a lot more gruesome and brutal in a more modern context. But I really enjoyed this film, and it ends on a cliffhanger, which actually is why it goes to Red versus Dead right here, the second one. But I would give this movie a 3.5 maybe out of 5. It was definitely a fun time, and I definitely would love to revisit it. It's just one of those schlocky slashers that I just really enjoy. But I feel like they upped it a lot in the second film, Red vs. Dead. This movie, I told you that the first film ends on a cliffhanger. Well, we find out that cliffhanger kind of goes into, the next scene where we have our lone survivor of this attack on the mountain who has recently got his arm cut off. But the leader of the zombies has also get his arm cut off near the end of the beginning of this movie, and he accidentally gets that arm connected to his body because they thought that the doctors thought that was his arm, and so now he has a zombie arm, and it starts going into a very hilarious direction, very a la like Shaun of the Dead. That's probably the closest thing to it. It definitely shifts more from the Sam Raimi stuff to more of that kind of whimsical but like over the topness of Edgar Wright. And I really love the way that Tommy kind of directs this. I didn't mention Tommy Wirkola is the one who directed these films. And, it's interesting too, this movie, that shift in the paradigm of what it kind of is portraying, it's not too much of a shift, but it's enough to where I started noticing how absurdly brutal this movie is going to be. And it ends with this really crazy fight all in a field, a bunch of zombies and some zombie killers in it, and there's a tank, and it's beautiful. But for me, this is a fun time, and I think it's better than the first one. I also didn't mention that the first film is in Norwegian. This one is in English. I think you can switch it up, but I tried to switch it up and switch it to Norwegian, but I think they filmed it in English, so I just watched it as it was. But that was a different, interesting twist. I'm wondering if that also just was commercial viability, probably some kind of choice there. But that was a terrific film. That was a 4 out of 5. It was really fun. I had a blast with it, and so definitely check out Dead Snow and Dead Snow 2, Red vs. Dead. Those movies are just so much fun, and it took me a while to get to them, but I had a blast, and I'm jumping into the horror season. But speaking of seasons, I also want to kind of shift from the horror that I'm about to jump into a little bit later into A Summer Story, right? Summer just ended, and A Summer Story is a film that I just recently picked up. I got this at a half-price book. It is starring James Wilby and Imogen Stubbs and also Susanna York. This is a terrific film directed by Piers Haggard, who directed Blood on Satan's Claw, which I didn't realize until after the credits, and I saw that his name was there, and I'm like, wait, I know that name, and I started thinking about it, and I'm like, wait, Blood on Satan's Claw, folk horror, and I love that film. But this movie is a terrific, it almost feels like something along the lines of, Howard's End, definitely very English period piece, very posh, a little bit something along those lines, but it is set in the early 1900s. Of this lawyer who goes into the small community and meets Imogen Stubbs and falls in love with her and has kind of a summer stay there with her, and promises to come back as he goes back to London, to the big city, and things kind of don't work out, and they kind of have this summer fling. And I really loved the way this movie kind of touched my heart. I didn't expect it to touch my heart as much as it does, but it really does, of that longing for something that was what once was. And it kind of ends in a very unique way that I don't necessarily want to spoil, but I think it's definitely worth watching, and definitely not your typical romance film from this period piece type of drama. But it definitely has, some moments that make it a little dull, or at least very posh, I guess. But I definitely would recommend checking this film out. I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. It's a great film. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I picked it up. So as we're transitioning into the fall. Goodbye, Summer Story. But speaking of transitions again, I recently have been watching a lot of soccer now, now that I'm watching the Premier League. We're on a break at the moment, but I do want to also mention the film Fever Pitch, which I just picked up as well, also alongside A Summer Story. I got this. This is from Twilight Time, and this is starring Colin Firth. This came out in 1997, but this is made actually from a Nick Hornby story, and I didn't realize this as I was watching this movie. I was like, this reminds me a lot of High Fidelity. And that makes sense because Nick Hornby did both. So, of course. But this story is about a love interest. First, we have Colin Firth's character, who is this big Arsenal fan who is kind of living the glory years. Is set back in the turn of the century when Arsenal kind of fallen off the map and hasn't been as good as they had been in the past. And Colin Firth really is in this boyish memory of how much he loves this team. And honestly, he's just so, very close-minded about everything else, but it's just very tunnel vision about it. This boyish Colin Firth, he meets this other teacher who is teaching next door, who is definitely cantankerous a little bit and very anti kind of fun, which is what Colin Firth definitely kind of draws to. But they fall for each other, and that relationship shines through with this, and they're opposites, and have how we kind of fall for people who are opposites of us, but also the things that we do to sacrifice and jump into a relationship. And one is she's starting to like football, even though she sees the obsessive nature that Colin Firth is going through, and definitely sees how much of a child he is in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily think this is saying much in terms of likable characters, but it is definitely kind of a realistic approach of how people are, right? But I had a fun time nonetheless. It was fun to kind of connect it with soccer, even though this is definitely a romance comedy of sorts. And seeing these two that don't really fit together come together, and it was a fun time nonetheless. I would give this movie maybe a 3.5 out of 5. It was a fun time. The next is a film that I've been wanting to watch for some time now, at least since leaving the UK when my friend Davey talked to me about it. There's the Indicator release of this, but I got the Kino Lorber release of They Will Be Giants, starring George C. Scott and Joanna Woodward, and this was so much fun. I just recently talked about it in my Blu-ray haul, how much I was looking forward to this movie, and this might be one of the biggest surprises of the week for me. And I love this character, who is George C. Scott's character, who is a little mad. He thinks he's Sherlock Holmes, right? And he is definitely brilliant in a lot of those ways, and he meets Dr. Watson right here, who is taking care of him, and she accidentally gets involved in a scheme, and they run off together, and they try not to get caught by all these really crazy characters, and Moriarty is at the heart of it, right? And I love the delightfulness of this film. It definitely is a slice of life time period. I feel like when I say slice of life, it feels like a 1970s film, through and through, a good time, a good just action oriented film that has really sharp dialogue. And I don't know, it was just so much fun watching these characters go through these really, really funny scenarios together, and just the banter between them is just a delight. I could watch it all day. But this came out in 1971, like I was mentioning. It definitely feels like a time vault to that time period, and feels really just delightful. It's a movie that I highly recommend people check out, and ends in kind of one of these special ways that made me crack a smile a lot as I was watching all these characters that we met throughout, the city that they inhabited, coming together, walking towards Moriarty, right? It's such a fun film. Definitely check out They Might Be Giants. Pick it up from Kino Lorber or Indicator. I'm sure there's some really great special features on those discs, but the movie alone is worth it. So let's go back to streaming for a second. I know I mentioned Creep, so I have to mention Creep 2. I watched this as well. On Friday, I watched this. This is from 2017, also directed by Patrick Brice, also starring Mark Duplass. So I didn't mention the ending of Creep, but Creep 2 kind of gets into a little bit of the spoiler territory, but I'm not going to spoil too much. But Mark Duplass is back again, kind of putting out the ad, of course, as he normally does, saying, hey, can somebody film me? And this woman who is played, I cannot remember her name, but Akavan, who has played Sarah in this film. She is somebody who is a struggling YouTube star who is trying to meet with these strange individuals who are just asking for, time or help or whatever they're asking for, and she just wants to film it and get a little bit more popular. And she meets with Mark Duplass, of course, who reveals to be a serial killer. And he reveals himself very fully out loud. He's like, hey, this is what I've done. I'm just did my 39th kill. I'm about to turn 40 myself, and I want somebody to, be here for me to kill myself for my 40th film. And it goes in a lot of really sharp and weird directions. Of course, it's that found footage story, and it goes in a lot of ways where I really enjoyed kind of the initial film of Creep kind of going the direction you would expect it to go, and this one going in directions you're like, okay, this is really refreshing. Just kind of see them pivot a little bit and kind of deep dive more into Mark Duplass's creepiness, of course, but also the fact that he can be so likable because he has these different quirks that have about himself that can get people curious about what he's going to do next. And that's kind of watching this movie, right? But also at the heart of it, he is an absolute creep. And so Creep 2 was a fun time and definitely a really great sequel to this really weird story that I finally was able to check up on. And I'd give this movie like a 4 out of 5. It was a fun time. Definitely creepy. All right, and the last streaming film I'm going to talk about is one that I guess I've been going through as I've been going through Significant Other, and also going through Wrong Turn. I decided to watch Backcountry, which came out in 2014, directed by Adam McDonald, about a couple based on true events. It's very loosely based on true events of a couple who goes out into the woods just to kind of rekindle their relationship a little bit, or just have this little getaway together. And they encounter a black bear, or at least they're in black bear country, and it goes in a very slow pace. It's a very slow burn film of sorts, and the action doesn't really pick up until kind of the last 30-40 minutes of the film. And it's worth it, though. It's worth it because the bear attack, holy shit. That is one of the most visceral things I've ever seen in my life in terms of what I've seen on film. Of course, this goes up there with the Annihilation bear attack, which is also very scary and very terrifying. And but I'm not going to get too much into it. If you want to see this movie, it's definitely worth watching, and definitely worth watching to that point and seeing that unfold, and then kind of the aftermath of it. Of course, there is a survivor who happens to tell the tale, and it is a scary one for sure, but it's definitely loosely based on true events, like I said. But that bear attack is worth it alone to watch this movie. I'd give it a 3 out of 5. I definitely really enjoyed it, but yeah, it's one that will probably scar me for a bit. And just yesterday, I wanted to finish up the Arrows that I had recently picked up. The first one being American Gigolo, directed by Paul Schrader. This came out in 1980, kind of fast off the heels of Taxi Driver, directing his own thing. Richard Gere is this gigolo who is kind of this unambiguous character who doesn't, you love him because he is Richard Gere, right? He's a very handsome guy. He's got charisma as well, but I feel like this film meanders a little bit in directions that I wanted it to go, but it didn't go the direction I wanted it. But going back into the vein of something like Mute Witness, of those De Palma type films, it really does reflect an underbelly of a world that you don't see very often, right? The gigolo world. And while he plays it really, really well, I definitely think that the story lacked a little something for me in terms of its revelation. And that is probably how much I'll reflect back on it. But I enjoyed it nonetheless. We also have Laura Hutton in this film, who is terrific as well as his love interest, getting outside of what he normally does. I think the cinematography in particular is probably the highlight of this film, and definitely worth checking out. I have the Blu-ray right here. I know it came out on 4K as well. I don't know which one is better, but I definitely enjoyed the way that shots were set up, and the way that the light was really played with this film. But nonetheless, I definitely feel like something was missing for me. I'd give this movie a 3 out of 5. It's one that I definitely could revisit and probably appreciate a little bit more, but definitely a fun time nonetheless. And American Gigolo, I think, is worth a watch. And the last film I want to talk about as I'm jumping and finishing off this giant week of 7 and 8, week 7 and 8, and we're finally to the modern era, is the film Barbarella, which I can't speak too much on, but holy crap, Jane Fonda. Holy crap. If you don't know about this movie, look it up. Definitely a really bizarre space adventure, a space odyssey of sorts, very much of its time. This came out in 1968, I believe. Let me check. Yeah, 1968. Directed by De Laurentiis, who is, I think, Jane Fonda's wife at the husband at the time. Just reverse there. They were together, De Laurentiis and Fonda. And so I think they definitely wanted to showcase Jane Fonda's sex appeal in this really crazy sci-fi story. But it was a really fun time nonetheless. I am a dude, so of course I enjoyed this quite a bit, but it's definitely schlocky as all get out. It reminded me of something like Xanadu, or like Xanadu would try to copy, or at least kind of elements of that, but obviously then this is more the schlocky sex appeal more so, but in a very fun way. And I definitely laughed quite a bit watching this movie. The special effects and practical effects going on in this are also quite kind of wild, and the outfits that Jane Fonda kind of switches in between is very tantalizing, of course. So yeah, Barbarella, fun time. I need to jump into the special features here and kind of see just the differences where people kind of love the impact of Barbarella. But this is a very impactful film, and I'm glad to finally have it on 4K and finally watch it. Definitely a schlocky mess, but is so much fun. But anyway, I want to say thank you so much for watching this super episode of weeks 7 and 8 of my film journey. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on Twin Peaks and all these movies that I covered, and are enjoying the double features that we're going to be doing each week. I would love to know what you've been checking out. And now it's time to finish this cup of coffee and say thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I'm not jonesing around.